Hi, I'm Robin, and I'm with the Leesport Area Historical Society, and we are here at the old Bellamons Church in Mooresville. It's a beautiful spot. It's on the National Places of Historic Registry. And since we can't have you come to us, we're going to start bringing programs to you. So we're excited to have our host and tour guide, Mr. John Roush, will be taking over the tour, giving us some history and showing us some of the points and details of this gorgeous gem in Northern Berks. So enjoy, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John, who's a local historian, former educator, and storyteller. Thanks for having us, John.
You're welcome. We're in Center Township. The church has been here, not this church, but the congregations have been here since 1746. This particular building was dedicated in May 1815. And we're going to walk around the outside of the church a little bit. There's some things there I would like you to see. And also on the inside, we're going to wind up in there then. We're looking at the large spiderweb window in the peak of the church. There were similar windows on both sides. The one, and this is on the east side of the church. The one on the west was replaced for the last time somewhere around 1923, when, according to tradition and oral history, a tornado took a window out. In repointing the church in 1996, people crawled up there and we found that we had 6 sets of windows. And from that we had this one reproduced at that particular time. You will not see this window once we get inside the church. And you'll notice the church was repointed for the first time that we're aware of. It was completed in 1996, which was the 250th anniversary of the congregations here at Bellamons, both Reformed and Lutheran. Today, of course, UCC and Lutheran, and we're still a shared ministry church. We're looking at the date stone of the church. It can be read with good sunlight. It states May 1815. That's when the church was dedicated, the beginning of the month of May. After this, we're going to be looking, and the date stone is over the center window in the side of the church facing the street. After this, we're going to be looking at the cornerstone. The cornerstone is exactly where it should be, on the corner of a building, and it's a sandstone. You might be able to see that it has a crack in it. Back in the mid-1980s, we did have it taken out. It came out beautifully. It had in some darkened paper, which was probably a Bible, and a bottle which probably contained some wine. In reinserting the cornerstone, the stone was broken. It was done by a professional stonemason. He was really upset with that particular predicament, but nothing we can do about it. We're looking at the foundation of the old church, and you'll notice there are air holes under it so that the woodwork underneath the building doesn't rot out. I've only ever seen that one other place, and that was in Australia, where a building that was built about the 1860s had exactly the same thing and with the exact same purposes. I talked to the individual in charge of that particular building. But basically, no rotting underneath the heavy structural timbers. We're zeroing in now on a gas lamp, which we would have found all around the church and in the churchyard where we're standing when they had picnics here, which would have been in the late 1800s. They would have held all their picnics right under the lamp, and coming out from the lamp would have been the food stands, and the people would have been purchasing food and what have you toward the fence, which is outside of this. So we have one lamp left. That's it. We're now looking at the original site of Bellamons Church, which was built in 1746. It was a log church, and I can guarantee you there's nothing left of that, because probing was done for our oldest son's Eagle project. We probed, couldn't find a thing, down to 4 feet. And as you look at the stones in the cemetery here, you did not own a grave in this particular cemetery. You had to be a contributor to the church. You had to contribute $1 per year. We're looking at the wine glass pulpit and the sounding board above that. You'll notice the steps going up, and the acoustics in this particular church are rather good. You don't really need any mic, and you can hear without a doubt. The paint, we don't know what the paint scheme was. That was put on about 1980. And you'll notice the wall hangings. That's a reproduction that, again, we had done in the early 1980s on bits and pieces we found in the closets. So those are not original, but it's a replica of what was in here. As you look at the side of the pulpit, you'll see the benches for the deacons, and they basically could keep a good eye, and they could always hear the minister, no doubt about that. The church also has what you will find in all new churches, a very modern thing, and that's a freestanding pulpit. I'm sorry, a freestanding altar. Older churches basically have the altar against the wall, but this is a freestanding altar, which is the hottest thing, at least it was a number of years ago, in church architecture. Around the altar you will find carpeting that we think is original to 1815. That particular carpeting around the altar. Going up the steps, you'll also, to the balcony, you also find that same carpet. We're looking at the oilcloth in front of the altar, and we also feel that was put in 1815. The purpose why there's no carpeting there is that there were two potbelly stoves, one at each end of the oilcloth, the linoleum, whatever you want to call it, but it was called oilcloth back then. From that particular potbelly stove on each end, a stovepipe went through the ceiling to a common chimney above the ceiling, and the chimney, of course, came out on the roof. So, in other words, they were interested in safety. And I can tell you, in the year 1950, 51, we had church in here for 10 months, and the potbelly stoves were the only source of heat. And I do not remember being cold in here. I don't know if my wife does or not. She doesn't want to remember that we were in here most times, but I'm not sure. But we were in here for 10 months while they were redecorating the new church. Okay, the east balcony is where the young males would be seated. As I said before, there was segregation, so to speak, male, female, and the young males sat up there, and it was stated many a minister could tell when he was going to get some business because of the looks that were coming from the upper balcony down to the seated area on the west side of the church on the main floor, where the young females sat. It was always an indicator that something was going to happen, probably a marriage. The church has never had electric, has never had central plumbing, any kind of plumbing, and also the only heat was, of course, the two potbelly stoves. There was an outhouse, which is a sizable hike beyond the end of the old cemetery. Those outhouses are no longer there, but they were used up into the 1970s. To be buried here, and of course the funeral would occur here in and around the altar, in front of the altar, and we do have a funeral bier on which the casket would be carried out to the graveyard, which is on the west and the north side of this church. To be buried there, you did not buy a lot. You had to be a contributing member of the church, and you were guaranteed a burial space. The great sum of $1 was what was required annually to guarantee your burial on the cemetery. In about 1972, we closed the burials on the old cemetery because we were afraid that some child of a former member would claim the right to be buried there, and the church would have to provide the digging and everything else associated with that. Plus, state rules changed about that particular period of time. So there haven't been any burials allowed, and there's a lot of room, but no burials. Okay, the doors are unusual. I've never seen anything like it in any other building, old building, even new buildings. I don't think you'll find much of it. But right here we have hinge marks. And all three doors of the church, and up there's one also, you have the hinge marks. These were bifold doors. And you'll also find in the middle where there were other hinges right here and down here and also up top. And over on this side, this door would have latched right here. There you can see where the latch was filled in. So that's true of all three doors. Okay, I'm standing here at an area where the big givers would have been seated in the church. Two of these boxes have doors. They're located very close to where the potbelly stove was. Plus, you can also close the door, which would keep the heat in. Again, these were reserved seats, and many seats were reserved in the church. In the memorabilia cabinet, we have a number of items. Probably the key is, the main one that we normally talk about in there, are the lottery boxes. Lotteries were held to build this particular church, and that was not unusual in religious congregations at the time this particular building was constructed. When the church was being considered to be, not abandoned, let's say, but when the new church was being considered, Wellington Dietrich, who was the president of Luden's Candies in Reading, who had a farm just at the end of Bellamons Church Road, stated that he would contribute money to build the new church and also $1,000 to maintain and preserve the old church, which we're in right now. The money was invested, of course, where you'd get the highest rate of interest. It was a 5% Kingdom of Italy gold bond. For some reason in 1940, the Leesport Bank notified the church that the Kingdom of Italy was no longer paying interest on this particular bond. Of course, I'm sure everyone who has any knowledge of history will know that was because Mussolini was in charge of Italy at that particular time. As we look at the church, some of the most frequently asked questions are, how long were the church services and what's the capacity of the church? As we look at it, the capacity of the church, we determined a couple years ago because we had a wedding here, and we think the church would seat about 350 people. Because of the length of the service, it's a lot long. They were a lot longer than they are today. There were provisions made for nursing mothers. As we look at that, the top of both or halfway up to the balcony, there are nursing benches where the mothers could nurse their children, and they could also hear the service, yet it was semi-private. As we look at the nursing benches where they are located, halfway up to the balcony, the carpeting there is exactly the same as around the altar. The church has a Bowler single manual hand pump pipe organ. The name Bowler only appears on the air gauge, and it wasn't until 2001 that a organ repair individual mentioned that, yes, it is a Bowler, because he has one also, similar to it. We don't think the organ was in from 1815, because we do know that there is a Bowler in Fleetwood, and they have receipts showing it was purchased in 1859. We don't know what was there, if it was just left in open space, in anticipation of putting an organ in the future. As we look beyond that, and again, you look at the ceiling, and the ceiling today, of course, is beautiful gray. That's at least what it was supposed to be, because in the early 1980s, there was a huge sag in the ceiling, and it was decided to put a new plaster coat on the ceiling with the pigment directly in the plaster, and it would be gray just as it was before. We're still waiting for it to fade to that particular gray, unless that's your interpretation of a color gray. On the far corner, you'll also notice then the trapdoor. The trapdoor leads above the ceiling where you can stand up, you can walk around, and in 1996 we found pieces of 6 circular spiderweb windows that they had just set up there when they put a new one in. You'll notice before we looked at the spiderweb window on the outside, and you do not see any of that in here. It's above the ceiling. There are also a lot of names carved and painted between the ceiling and the rafters as such, and on the rafters. power to power the organ is, of course, provided by an individual who has to pump anytime the organist wants to play. If there's a dispute between the two, of course, the organist doesn't look very good. The organ does take quite a bit of air, and I know that back in, I think it was 1985, our youngest son pumped the whole service. It was about 90-some degrees, and he went home and slept the entire Sunday afternoon because it wore him out. And he's not a small boy. He was not a small boy. It is something that has to happen to keep the organ running. As we look at the new gray ceiling, which of course looks mostly green, we have to be reminded also that before the old ceiling was torn down, there was a rectangle with a circle inside of it in the middle of the ceiling with a hook in the middle of that particular circle. We were told, or history has it, oral history has it, that there was once a chandelier. No one has ever seen or really has a picture or anything like that of the chandelier. We do have bits and pieces of the rectangle and also the circle, and hope one day, we don't know when, to put that back up there. It appears as though it was basically wallpaper border that was up there as a rectangle and as the circle. There were some other churches that looked very similar to this, although they were both, one was brick, one was stone. One is still standing. That's the church at Intermission, which is at Tuckerton. It's now a Pentecostal church, and when they held an anniversary about 25 years ago, their whole congregation came here in period costume and held their service here. The other church that was torn down in the late somewhere around 1908, 1910, would be Zines Church, Windsor Castle. That was a stone church, but again, they also videoed their particular anniversary service here because of the interior being almost exactly the same. There's also a church over in Lancaster County that I'm aware of that I haven't gotten to yet, that I've seen pictures and it looks exactly the same. There's also a house about a mile and a half from the church that was built in 1819 that is stone, that has many of these same features. The church is usually used for 3 services a year plus a hymn sing. Usually the services are the Sunday before Memorial Day, the last Saturday in September. I'm sorry, that's a Pennsylvania Dutch service. There's a regular service here on the last Sunday in September, and then the Pennsylvania Dutch service the last Saturday in September, plus the last Saturday in April, we have a hymn sing in here in the afternoon. Church is also used for weddings. It's available for tours. It's been used for recordings by some musical groups also. If you'd like to see the church, you can call me, John Roush. I'm in the book, 610-488-1400. If you'd care to contribute to the upkeep of the church, you could send that to the Bellamons Church Trustee Fund, 3540 Bellamons Church Road, Mooresville, Pennsylvania, 19541. If you have any other questions about the old cemetery or the church, contact me. I'm in charge of the church. Or you can contact the church and they'll put you through to me some way, shape, or form.